Hello and welcome back into the Hail Varsity YouTube channel. I am Greg Smith, recruiting extraordinaire for Hail Varsity. I am joined once again for a Thursday football video by Steve Marik, staff writer of Hail Varsity as well. Steve, how are you this morning?
I'm doing great. Covered a baseball game last night. They won. Nebraska beat North Dakota State by 1 run. That's their fifth. Count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fifth 1-run win of the season. So they got out of there with a win, but ready to talk some football this morning with you.
Yeah, it's interesting. Baseball, it feels like, has been in a lot of either very close games or blowouts. Like there's no in between.
All the time. It's
like
close all the
like
time.
one or the other, which, could produce some interesting results down the road if, you keep on the winning side of that. You get battle tested, right? But we're not.
That's a good way to put it, sure.
Yeah, there we go. I'll go glass half full on that. Battle tested is the way to go there. But we are here to talk some football. And yesterday we were back on, and make sure you go back after you watch this video and see the reaction, the kind of raw reaction to the Casey Rogers news of Casey Rogers, Nebraska defensive lineman, entering the transfer portal. Then Steve and I reacted to that. You can check that out right here on the Hail Varsity YouTube channel. But today we're going to kind of continue the discussion on that in a different way, and just kind of look at how Nebraska can really move forward from here, right? As yesterday, I think that once you get there's two ways of this, right? You have, especially in a situation like this, where you have kind of that initial surprise about the actual news. And then immediately it goes into, at least for us, it did, because we talked about it yesterday, got them off pod, like what happens, or off video, what happens next, right, for Nebraska? And so there's a couple of things and a couple of avenues and paths that I think we think Nebraska can take to be able to help out that defensive line as you get closer to it. Is it August 27th, when you'll already be over in Dublin if you're in Nebraska, getting ready to kick off against Northwestern. So I guess, Steve, what's the first thing that I guess comes to mind for you is how Nebraska can address what's now a major issue on the defensive line?
You're absolutely right. It is a major issue, contrary to what some people in Husker Nation seem to think, but it's got to be the transfer portal. Hit the transfer portal hard. Look for some inside interior D lineman guys, preferably with playing experience that know what it takes to compete, at the Division I level, like inside going up against, big boy tackles, centers, and guards. So yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind with me is, taking a peek in the transfer portal and looking at who's available, because as you mentioned in our Wednesday, reaction video, there's going to be another wave coming once programs get done with their springs. There's going to be just a whole bunch of more names in the transfer portal for Nebraska to look at, and boy, do they need to look there.
Yeah, they absolutely do. And it's one of the things, and a few weeks ago, and I've had a few stories referencing this over on hailvarsity.com, and I probably mentioned it on the recruiting question of the week video, that when I got a chance to sit down with Vince Guinta, who's Nebraska's new senior director of recruiting and player personnel, and we actually asked him about the transfer portal and how that relates to his job with high school recruiting. And I actually thought that his quote goes really well with what's happening right now. I'm going to read to you guys. He said, first, he said, yeah, it does come into his job, but he said that there's a lot of overlap now in the world that we live in at this point. It's such that you have to plan on recruiting the portal when players become available, because we have to also assume that you're probably going to have a guy or two that you weren't planning on your team that's going into the portal. So you always have to be prepared to do that, and just know that you're going to have a certain percentage of your recruits each cycle that are coming from the portal. And so hearing that from the person that runs Nebraska's recruiting department, it should give you a little bit of hope that Nebraska, just in general, not necessarily in particular to this Casey Rogers news, but in general, does put in contingency plans, or is always at least in the back of their mind, that you may lose a guy or two that you weren't expecting, right? And so I don't want to make it sound like I definitely am not saying that they wanted Casey Rogers to leave by any stretch of the imagination, but I also don't want it to seem Like, just because they're, thinking about these things doesn't mean that it's something that you can just easily bounce back from. Because in this particular situation on the defensive line, even though they say that they're always looking at these things, and of course they're going to continue to recruit the portal, that doesn't necessarily mean that defensive line was a position that they could just afford to have someone leave, right? Like, I think that, like, for example, we have a real example here of the last two kind of big names to leave the program, Xavier Betts and Casey Rogers. The reaction to Xavier Betts and kind of spinning it forward, to me, is a lot different, or should be different, than it is with a defensive lineman, because Xavier's a wide receiver, right? You brought in all these wide receivers. You've got a coach that's very well established and known for bringing talent in at the collegiate level. And some of those things that are happening at wide receiver, and the depth that they have at wide receiver, just isn't there on the defensive line at this point. So it's two different situations, but that's why I think you should have two totally different reactions and responses to what's happening at those positions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a different, I guess, situation over there in the receivers room than it is on the D line.
Yeah, there wasn't panic when that happened, right? Even though Xavier is very talented, there was not a panic after that news.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're like, the wide receiver room has bodies to work with. They have options to go with. It is not the same way with the interior D linemen on the defense. And to your point with Vince Ginta, I really like Vince Ginta. I think he's a really smart dude. He he's good at building relationships, and just look at where he came from with Baylor. Dave Aranda is doing a heck of a job over there, just kind of rebuilding that program from what happened down there. And just recently they've done really well recruiting when, they're in a state that gets rated every single season by bigger programs in the SEC. So I really like that Vince Ginta is on board, and I think he definitely has a plan. Like you mentioned, he's aware that transfers are going to come in and transfers are going to go out. So I think they're still definitely maybe didn't want Casey obviously to go, Casey Rogers, but again, it's not a 100% shock, I guess, because just it's good to keep in the back of your mind that this could happen.
Yeah, in this era that we're in. Yeah,
in the era that we're in. So I definitely think that Vince and the program were kind of prepared for something like this happening, but still it sucks. Now you have to just go out and get and find bodies, and maybe it's not as easy as maybe a lot of people think it is.
No, I definitely think that. I definitely think that, and it's not even just, what to me, what the big problem is with this, it is the position, right?
Yeah.
It is totally, I think that defensive line recruiting like normal, like high school and I guess JUCO recruiting and transfer is really hard to get those guys because there's so few of them. And it's the position that no matter like what style of defense you play, every team wants really good defensive linemen, and those same high-level guys are always going to be sought after by everybody, right? And because you can rotate, really good teams. You look at like Georgia and Clemson in recent years, and I guess I should say recent years. I always think of Clemson as saying like they've had a down year last year. They won double-digit games. That's the year there. But Clemson has done this. Georgia, obviously, Alabama, obviously. Those teams will rotate, 6, 7, 8 good defensive linemen. That's the goal. That's where you want to get to. And so because of that, every team is after these defensive linemen, right? And they know too that the more fresh snaps that you can play, the better. So they're not always just looking to go to a place where they can get 75 snaps a game. If they can get a good 45 and be really effective and go to the league, that's really good too. But I want to hit on the other side of this. And we talked a lot about the portal and how that can potentially help Nebraska. The other thing is development, right? Like, I think that part of and we've heard this a lot in the last, it's been less than 24 hours since the news came out as of us recording this video. How many times, Steve, in your mentions have you seen, the portal is going to be it? We're going to go upgrade in the portal, which is fine. Like, they're going to definitely try to do that, but there has not been as much, hey, we're going to develop the guys that are, or hopefully the coaching staff is going to develop the guys that are already here in the program. I think that has to be a critical piece of this as well. And on the glass half full side of this, all of those guys that were healthy and went through full spring this year, they got all the reps that they could handle, right? So they have got a lot of film to be able to take this summer to then study that film. And I think it was Mosiah Newsom that said this after the spring game, maybe, that they're going to, his number one thing he wanted to do after like going into this offseason was get in the lab, study the film, see where he needed to get better, and then try to take that out to Hawks in the practice field and get better at that. And so that is the one good thing, is that all of the guys that were here and went through spring, because Casey had already missed spring, those guys got a whole bunch of reps to be able to hopefully learn what they need to do to get better, to be able to contribute to the team in the fall.
Yeah, that's a great point with the being kind of a development program, because it doesn't seem like Nebraska is that. And then when you look around the Big Ten West about other teams that you need to beat to reach goals every single year, guys like Wisconsin and Iowa, those are developmental programs. They're doing it right. And Nebraska, I think, is just, you're not seeing the development on the same level as the teams that you need to beat to reach goals. And so I just think that the developmental part of the whole thing just needs to keep getting better and better and better at a place like Nebraska, because I don't think it's there right now. And then you look at, places like Wisconsin and Iowa, they're obviously doing it right, and they have an identity and they know what they're going to be every single year, it seems. And, it just doesn't seem like Nebraska has an identity, and it doesn't seem like they're developing pieces right now. So,
and part of it too is like, and we may have said this in a previous video, and I think part of the issue with the guys on the defensive line is that you need them to be further along in their development. Yeah. Like, some of these guys are legitimately young, and have only, especially when you're talking about the defensive line and how long it really should take for those guys to develop, it should take 2 to 3 years basically for them to develop. And some of those guys are in that realm right now, and some are not, a little bit ahead of that. So I almost feel like sometimes we're doing a disservice to those guys by having to count on them so much so quickly. But you're just going to have to make that work, right? If you're Nebraska, like somebody in that Colton Feast, Mosiah Newsom, Nash Hutmacher group is definitely, like, 2 at least of those guys, hopefully all 3, if you're Nebraska's sake, can give you 20 to 30 snaps in a game. But then you really need to have, a Jalen Weaver or a Ruquan Buckley or Marquise Black, like someone like that has to then also be that 10 snaps a game maybe, or he has to be okay, if something were to happen to one of those other guys, we can then have them step in and not be too much of a drop off. I think that when we talk about the development, I do want to make sure we say, it's sometimes a little much to project some of those guys to be 50 snap a game, like honorable mention all Big Ten guys at this point in this stage of their career. But that's not even what they need at this point. It's just that there's a little bit of a gap there between where they are in their development stage and then not having some more older guys to be able to lean on as well, which comes all the way back to what's happened with the attrition in the room, because Casey Rogers was a 4th-year guy, 5th-year guy coming in.
I think it was going to be his 5th year. So that's kind of like what you're hoping for, really.
That's what you needed, right? You needed, in Nebraska's case, a guy like DeAndre Thomas to not retire from football and come back. You needed Damian Daniels to come back. You needed Jordan Riley. You needed Feldarius Payne. Those guys were all of your seasoned guys that you would need to help bridge that gap, have left the program, right? And that just kind of goes into a totally different discussion about, whether or not there's an issue in that room, whether or not those guys were just done with college football in the case of DeAndre Thomas. Like, there's a lot there. But either way, Nebraska has to field the defensive line, because, oh, by the way, August 27th in Northwestern will be here before you know it.
Yeah. And it draws comparisons to you talking about the development and kind of being older is better. That's true, just nowhere else more than just the line of scrimmage, because on the offensive line, it's the exact same thing. If you're like an all-conference offensive lineman, you're a junior or a senior or a 4th-year player or a 5th-year player or a 6th-year player. The older, the better you get when you get down there near the ball, near the line of scrimmage, and it's kind of a man's game. And it just makes sense because older guys tend to do really a lot better. Did a story on that at hailvarsity.com a few months ago about just looking at the average ages of all conference offensive linemen across the Power 5 conferences. And all of them, it's just on average, junior, senior, junior, senior. You just keep seeing it all over. So yeah, it's just, development is extremely important, especially in a conference like the Big Ten. Yeah. And right now you're just not seeing it kind of on both sides of the ball here at Nebraska.
Yeah, it's a rough place to be in, where the lines of scrimmage for Nebraska they've really had a rough time with the development piece here. And this, I mean, it goes back some years, right? I think that's been one of the bigger problems in the program, just years now. You've got I think you have some hope on that offensive line. And I think that you still have some guys that you really hope that can be molded into something on that offensive line. But I'm sure we'll be talking more about that, because that's going to be kind of a huge topic going, especially once we get into fall camp. I think that we'll kind of end up circling back to the offensive line is a really key part of what's going to happen for the 2022 season. And there's definitely some big question marks there. But for today's video, that's going to do it for us. Make sure you're liking and subscribing to the video. Check out that other video that we talked about before with reacting to the news from yesterday of Casey Rogers. We also have some stuff up on hailvarsity.com. Make sure you're subscribing to the website as well. Get the magazine. We got the yearbook. The football yearbook is coming up here soon. We'll put a lot of hard work into that. We will catch you guys next time.